Peace, everyone. When it comes to people commonly identified with gentrification, queer and trans folk often find themselves lumped together with developers, hipster millennials, artists, dog walkers, and other icons of community change. But race always has a way of disrupting otherwise convenient conversations. When upwardly mobile or formerly well-educated newcomers to neighborhoods like Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy are also queer and trans people of color, where do you draw the lines between oppression and privilege, between the instigators of change and the casualties of it? Joining us today to lend a corrective LGBTQ lens on our popular understanding of gentrification are Bklyn Deep journalist Jarrett Lyons, who's been reporting on this issue. Thanks for being here, Jarrett. And Ryann Holmes, who is the co-founder of Bklyn Boihood, a Brooklyn-based collective that works to build community and healthy masculinity in the queer community. Jarrett and Ryann, welcome to you both. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jarrett, you've been reporting on gentrification for Bklyn Deep. Mm-hmm. Why this story? You know, what, in a sense, we're asking this question whether trans and queer people of color can be gentrifiers. Like, what do we get by asking that question?
Well, as you said, queer people are generally lumped together in mainstream narratives, right, with developers and upwardly mobile white gay populations. And this was kind of a way to build a narrative, because the first step, I think, would be to build the narrative if it's not there, especially from the points of view of the people who are having those experiences, right, specifically queer and trans people of color.
Right, right. I mean, and have you, in that investigation, did you learn anything new? Or, I mean, did it just sort of affirm some assumptions that you've had already?
I learned, I would say that, as you said, race plays a huge part in it.
Right.
So eventually a lot of the conversations, the queer perspective it was there, and then it kind of like dropped out, because one of the main perspectives would be race on the situation.
And we're going to deal with that. I mean, there's this, you know, obviously there's these cross currents of race and gender identity and sexual preference. Ryann, if we can jump into it, how long have you lived in Central Brooklyn? If you can just sort of say how the experience of living in Central Brooklyn has informed your view of gentrification and your place in that conversation.
So I've been a resident of Central Brooklyn for over 10 years now. Uh-huh. And my experience has varied, honestly. I definitely feel that as a Black person, and as a visibly queer and trans person, you know, we face a lot of issues that I feel like are parallel with the folks that we join community with. So, you know, I've heard the conversations of being like a Black gentrifier and all these other things, but I just feel so much conflict within myself, you know, coming from an all-Black community and moving to an all-Black community doesn't necessarily feel.
And where were you coming from? What community were you coming from?
So I was born in Washington, D.C. and raised nearby, right outside of the city in Maryland. And, you know, was just a young, queer, gay person who didn't necessarily feel safe in my environment and didn't feel like I was fully expressive and all these different things. Right. So basically just kind of up and moved to New York, feeling like that would be a place that I could be a little bit more free and, you know, have access to people and things that I didn't know about. And, you know, I felt like I was actually joining a community that felt familiar to me. And in a lot of ways, though, there were a lot of things that didn't feel familiar to me. But I felt it was my responsibility, and always has been, to kind of get in where I fit in and join the front lines, because the same battles that are happening in my home city are happening here. Right. And instead of just kind of like coming in and enjoying all of the wonderful things that Brooklyn has to offer, I'm also, along with a lot of other queer and trans people, on the front lines. Right. And trying to basically organize and uphold our own safety and the people around us that we love and care so much about, even if sometimes that's not reciprocated based on your own, you know, idea of what you think a queer trans person is. We also, I've been evicted by a Black landlord, right. Face housing discrimination. Many of my friends are facing housing discrimination issues that people wouldn't even believe are happening in this country.
Right.
So, and then aside from that, like just this sense that the white folks that are moving in are being protected, and that there's so much policing and all these things, and us having to interact with NYPD and stuff like that. So I feel like, you know, my role in it is making sure that I use any access to any privilege or power that I have or I'm coming from, and bringing that into the spaces that I feel like it can be a benefit to other people. And also just acknowledging that wealth has already existed.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of economic diversity in Brooklyn, and there are a lot of black people that are wealthy and have been activated and organized in their community. So I just feel like I'm really working hard to be a part of that and call this place home.
No, I appreciate that, and some of those issues we're going to come back to in a moment, particularly around safety and, you know, what people are feeling today. Jarrett, in the reporting that you've done, have you seen any difference in terms of how white folks or black folks sort of respond to LGBTQ folks of color? Is there any difference between those, you know, people who see them as gentrifiers, who don't see them as gentrifiers, or is it the same across the board racially? Do you see any distinctions?
Do you mean, is it the same across the board in terms of whether the people I interviewed consider white people
just
gentrifiers
how
in
folks
general?
are perceived, right? So whether it's Ryann or anyone else who's of color, who's in the LGBT community, have you, in doing the reporting, have you noticed that there's any difference in how white folks respond to them as being gentrifiers or not gentrifiers, or black folks? Has there been any differences?
There was definitely a case where one of my sources mentioned that she's not seen as having the same economic pull necessarily in her area because she's black as a white person. So therefore, when she speaks to her white friends about whether or not she's a gentrifier, they don't see it because they don't see that they don't consider her to be somebody with power in terms of affecting gentrification.
Other white folks.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because I kind of wonder, I think, like, if white folks weren't moving in like multitudes that they are, would we be talking about this?
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Would there be a phrase called, I don't even know though, you know what I'm saying? I don't know, but I'm, you know, I just feel like just kind of tagging along to that thing around power, especially as queer and trans people of color and just being black, you know, we kind of get this, one of my friends just told me it's called imposter syndrome, where you feel like you literally don't belong anywhere, and that it really, you know, that can really kind of mess with people's mental, physical, whatever. So,
and can you separate the blackness from being black and you know, queer and trans, or is it sort of all? Everything is so complex. Like I'm speaking literally from my own experience, but there's so many other experiences and narratives. You know what I'm saying? So. There's no way to separate the things that make us who we are. Like those are all. It really just depends on what system you're interacting with, and I feel like the conversation being kind of directed towards queer and trans folks is just another way to kind of like point blame when that's actually not the conversation we need to be having. Right. I
feel like, you know.
Well, what is the conversation we need to be having?
I don't know. I feel like this stuff starts back before we even thinking about it. You know, like these developers already decide where they're going to make, you know, things happen and how they're going to rezone different communities. Before we even get to the community board meeting, that is let's not go this direction. So I think it's really just about, and on a lot of levels too, because there are black people who move here and their politics are crazy. You know what I'm saying? There's definitely, and I've had to unpack my own stuff at home and here around like class and different things, but basically I just feel like the conversation has to be about all the systematic oppression that is the result of all these things that we're talking about. You know, we're constantly, it's definitely important to talk about the nuances, but we can't get too caught up and not forget that we're up against something really huge.
Right, right.
You know, that's sweeping people off of their feet and literally pushing them out of their homes.
There's so much you said there and so much I want to tackle, but we don't have a whole lot of time. So I want to zero in on something that you brought up before, which is this question of safety, right? Because I think that, you know, there's a certain level of insecurity that black folks feel in Central Brooklyn in general, and oftentimes from the point of view of the police. You know, I mean, I feel much more at risk walking by a police officer than I do, you know, a fellow black person in Crown Heights or Bed-Stuy. But when you talk about queer and trans folks, there's an extra level, I think, of insecurity that is felt. How does gentrification play a role in that insecurity? To either of you, I mean, what is your reporting showing, Jarrett?
Well, again, like once traditionally black areas have been gentrified, the policing goes up.
Right.
And queer and trans folks of color are the people who are victims of that system. It's not that they're being protected necessarily. We're seeing it this on this past weekend at Reese Beach. We saw that things. There. Yeah, you were there that day.
You were there.
Yeah, it's.
We had an event.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. So just tell us real quick.
Maybe you want to.
Well, there was a few different situations. Like, there's one that's like in the news now about like a man being dragged off the beach or whatever. We basically had like a beach day, like a gathering where we asked people to come out.
And you say we, meaning?
Brooklyn Boihood.
Oh, okay.
We had a red, black, and green flag up. We're like, this is where you meet us at for this Independence Day that ain't really for us, right? And we literally, like, I mean, Reese Beach, it's always been a place that we go. You know, it's typically, there's a lot of black and brown bodies. There's a lot more white folks now. I don't know if historically how it's been, but we literally had to intervene. A cop on a horse who was like illegally searching two folks that he felt were the most vulnerable. He asked them for their documentation to prove that they, you know, were legally in this country or whatever.
Wow.
That he patted him down. I have it all on my cell phone if y'all want to put this on the news. He patted him down. He, you know, went through their bags and all this stuff. We recorded it, had to intervene and deal with it. And luckily, 3 out of 5 of the members of Brooklyn Boihood work for the Center for New Leadership, so we had the resources and like the acumen and all these different things that we could be like,
the average person is not.
This is how you deal with that, right? But that's where they're mistaken, because there were plenty of lawyers on Reese Beach of color.
They picked the
there
wrong
were plenty,
people.
you know what I'm saying? There were people there that were ready and armed, but at the same time, and then you saw what happened, and they were like, you know, trucks and police. It was a terribly oppressive experience. We literally packed up and left after that dude got dragged off, and you know, and kind of came back to like, all right, what do we need to do to have space? Because anytime we've done an event for Pride season in the public space, it's been overrun by cops. You know what I'm saying? Who are agitated, who don't want to, you know, they're not respecting who we are. They don't care to listen or anything. It's all about how do we reach this vulnerable community and lock their asses up.
Right.
Like, I don't even know if I could curse on here, but.
Well, it's live, so.
So, yeah.
Well, let me just ask you this. So, when we're talking about community, we don't have a lot of time left, but when we talk about community, I need to have a sense of, when we talk about queer and trans community, people of color, how does real estate sort of factor into that? That is, you know, are queer and trans people of color able to maintain community? How important is physical space to maintaining that community?
Well, this is the inherent violence of gentrification across the board, regardless of race. Any oppressed community who was able to find an enclave or some place where they could form a community, it's the physical space is getting broken up now.
Right.
And then there's less conversation, there's less art, there's less all the stuff that builds narratives and imagination in order to maybe build change is being destroyed.
Yeah, even me and my roommate, my former roommate and friend of mine, who is the founder of Black Trans Media, we were living together at one point and were evicted, but we used that space a lot to hold space, to keep people, if they were homeless for a couple of nights until they could figure out secure situations. You know, he would host Transgiving and different events and stuff like that, Brooklyn Boihood parties, and that space is gone. you know? And we basically, that was just it. Like, we tried to kind of hold it in other ways, but the result is just there.
Yeah.
And we're left to...
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there, but we've only begun to skim the surface, obviously. So thank you, Jarrett and Ryann, for joining us here today. You can find more from Bklyn Deep, including Jarrett's article on this topic at brooklyndeep.org, or find us on the web. We are Bklyn Deep on Facebook and at BKLYN Deep on Twitter.